what I think is good is that there is now really strong attempts and groups to learn other people's cultures. For Korean Americans to learn African American culture, for African Americans to learn the Korean American culture.
Welcome to the Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the Race to Social Justice podcast. I'm Kiva White, and as you can see, I'm the black guy.
And I'm John Kepner. I'm the white guy. We're continuing tonight with our former guest, Jimmy Chong, and this is going to be a coda to our former recording with Jimmy because we just didn't have enough time, and we have some significant issues that we'd like to cover that we didn't in the last podcast. It's a difficult subject because it's all about violence against a part of America, of fellow Americans. And the fear that they live with. And to set the stage, I'm going to just reference an article in a guest essay in the New York Times by Min Jin Lee, who is a writer in residence at Amherst College. And the title of it is Asian Americans Have Always Lived with Fear. And she came to this country in 1977, a year after her parents and two sisters arrived in New York from Seoul, Korea, and they lived in Manhattan's. They set up a wholesale jewelry business in Manhattan's Koreatown. And in 3 columns of her essay, she goes through the litany of violence against her parents and their business, including some robberies and so forth that completely wiped out the entire business. They had to start all over. And then well-educated at Yale, she became a lawyer, but she then chronicles the violence against her own personal self as she was growing up, including sexual violence. And she traces it to her Korean American experience. And she concludes by saying this: ever since Asians began arriving in the United States, they've been met with hostility and rejection, often sanctioned by state and federal legislation. The sad part is that so little has changed. Back in the 70s and 80s, the West feared the growth of Japan. As China became a superpower, xenophobia rose too. Since 9/11, Islamophobia and attacks against Sheiks and Hindus have been unrelenting. Now the pandemic and demagoguery have brought more waves of hatred. Do I reasonably expect another person or government body to keep me safe in some perfect way? I can't say that I do. A person like me often finds workarounds. But you and I know a workaround is not a real solution, and a temporary fix is never available to everyone who needs it. Asians and Asian Americans pay the price of nativist fear. As income inequality grows and social services are cut, the vulnerable among us are left untreated and unhoused. Meanwhile, the number of attacks in the United States against Asians and Asian Americans grows. So that's a powerful, powerful statement based upon, real life experience. And so, Jimmy, after our last podcast, you wrote I thought, a very sensitive and insightful email to Kiva and me that I'd like to read to set the stage and then take the discussion from there. I don't think the Asian American experience is unique in that light, that is in referring to dealing with discrimination. However, I do think mainstream America is seeing that this hate exists, which is unique. In other words, for the most part, Americans think there has been and is little to no discrimination against Asian Americans, and that we are mostly successful and wealthy, which is far from the truth. We have been suffering from real hate and violence, but Americans have denied that it has existed in American history. For that reason, I believe Asian Americans are very vocal about the extension of AAPI hate since we immigrated here. And it is only now that mainstream America accepts the truth. The caveat that I have is that I don't want non-Asians to think Asian Americans don't understand other races have experienced the same and or worse experiences. Our frustration is that mainstream America and other minority groups in America have never understood this hate existed. Now that there is an acceptance that this hate exists, we are letting it all out, and I think it's being misinterpreted as insensitivity to others. There's a lot built into that. And maybe we should start by, you want to elaborate that or go deeper on that, Jimmy?
Well, I think that when I was writing that, there had been just a lot of buildup throughout, since COVID, and with a lot of things that had been happening since COVID, with the riots, with the deaths by police. There have been a lot of comments that Asian Americans don't, I guess, aren't always supportive of other minority groups, or that Asian Americans have never really been discriminated against, and that there's been meetings. So I've been very involved in the DEI world, and there have been meetings where I've been told that we should not promote, we as a community should not say stop AAPI hate. It should be stop all hate, and that Asians are getting, I guess, a benefit or a pass, or they're being given a luxury, something that felt like something that it's not deserved, because Asian Americans don't understand what it's like to be discriminated against. And that's really what has been told to my face, that we are the model minority, that we have not been through hard times. And I say we generally. And that's where I want to start, because Americans will look at Asian Americans as similar: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and they're East Asian. There's Indians, there's Filipino. We are nothing alike culturally, language, the way we go about religions. It's not similar. However, here in America, we're bunched as one. So that is, I guess, the first that's one of the first things I do want to express to mainstream America, because a lot of times that you cannot distinguish between the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino. We're grouped as one. And then we're grouped as the model minority, where they believe that we're successful, we have not been through hard times. And when you look at the basic economics of it, the poorest in this country, there's many Asian American communities that are economically the poorest. Now, there are many that are on the wealthy side of things, but the way that it's looked at is that Asian Americans are always successful, and that there's been no struggle, that that there's always been, we've always put our heads down, work hard, and we're successful. And there's comments that the government had given Asian Americans money to be successful, that we've been given advantages over other communities to be successful. There have been accusations of that has been told to me, and saying, well, we're, and it's very frustrating, because it's the furthest thing from the truth. So I was born and raised here. My English is my native language. My Korean is very poor. However, growing up, there's a lot of comments that people are shocked. They tell me I speak English, I speak English good. It's so funny. They say, oh, Jimmy, you speak English really good. And I'm like, well, I do speak it well, but it's my native language. I've had comments where, someone's come to me and said, wow, you're a good-looking Chinese guy. And, it's a compliment, but it's kind of a backhanded compliment saying, Chinese guys aren't good looking or Asian guys aren't good looking. So there are certain things that I don't think mainstream America sees. Growing up in Delaware, I was one of the very few Asians. So I got in fights daily. I actually, at school, I would have to defend myself because I was the only Asian out there. And it got to a point where I would come home every day beat up. And I actually was pulled out of school because it happened so much that my parents feared for my safety.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these things that I don't think mainstream America really sees or understands. And that's why this frustration builds within Asian Americans. And that's why now we're exploding and being very vocal. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really where it was really rooted. And that email, I just really had to express it in that way.
Sure. But we're seeing more reports than ever of violence against Asian Americans. That is different, I think. And I want to get to the Rodney King thing in a minute because I was not really aware of the violence that resulted from that at all.
I think it's more than, it's the stereotypes, the generalization. When you talk about Jimmy clumping all Asians into one bucket, and I think with over the past several years or so, 4 years or so, it's those social narratives that kept being repeated over and over and over that really shedded a negative light on the image of Asian Americans in this country in the wake of the pandemic. A lot of negative, derogatory things were being said about people in high positions in this country regarding how the pandemic started, where it came from. I remember in Philadelphia, and you probably remember this, Jimmy, where Chinatown was empty. Nobody wanted to even, purchase, go there to purchase food because of the rhetoric and the narratives that were being, bellowed out from our nation's capital. So I think all of those things, you're 100% right that the generalization and the stereotypes that exist really leads to unwarranted violence by Asian Americans in this country because of the image that was created. Again, these are all, when we talk about racism being a social construct, I truly believe that it's how people in society construct these images based on repeated words, repeated images. If you look at, the media today, every time you see a breaking news, I cringe when I see that because they keep showing repeat the same clip over and over and over again. And it has a real psychological impact on society if we don't, really understand how these type of things work. We talked about Barbara Love's article all the time, the liberated consciousness. And one of the things that she talks about is how we all have been socialized in society to play certain roles based upon what's been taught, how we've been educated, or the lack thereof. So, John, I hear you say you didn't know about the Rodney King and the violence that persisted in that. To me, that's a win because now this is the opportunity. It's a teachable moment for you to get some understanding. I grew up in that era. I watched it on the news over and over and over and over again. And I understand the violence that took place not only against African Americans in their own community, but also against Asian Americans that lived in that community. So I'm glad we're having this discussion because it's 30 years ago.
Yeah. So Jimmy, tell the story. Let's set the table on what we're talking about. Some people may not know about Rodney King or have seen it and what that led to in terms of attacks on the Asian community.
Sure. It really, and forgive me because I may not have all the timing right. Mm-hmm. Just it's kind of a blur, but first it really started back really in the 80s and the 90s where the 80s, early 90s, Koreans, and I'm talking about LA, and it really can happen in Philadelphia, in any major city where a lot of Korean Americans they started immigrating to America in the early 70s, early 70s. And they come over, they start establishing themselves. And then really a huge rush comes over in the 80s, and they start opening stores within the city. So in urban areas, Korean Americans would open stores, and in the urban areas, it would be mostly African Americans who would be, the customers, would be the patrons of the stores. So then they would see the Korean Americans start being successful, start, driving nice cars, taking the money they've earned, leaving the city, moving to the suburbs, and then coming in. And there started being a dissension between the patrons and the store owners, where they believe the store owners were taking the money from the city and taking it out of the city, not contributing back. Now, I believe that's where cultural issues started happening, because Koreans, their culture, they put their head down, they will work, and they will work 12, 16-hour days. And they will, they will start making some wealth and some money, but they're saving, they're not spending, there's no vacations, they're not buying nice clothes, they're just saving, and saving, to where then they can buy a home or then buy that nice car, but they're not spending money on anything else. When it comes down to it, their hourly wage is very minimal, but they're working as family units, mother, father, all the kids would go to the store. They would work 7 days a week. And that's, I think, part of the things that people did not see. They just all of a sudden saw wealth coming into these Korean American families. So that kind of sets the stage where the dissension started happening. Well, while this is going on, some in the urban areas, these Korean store owners, they were being robbed daily. So someone would steal, a box juice here, maybe steal a CD there, or steal something from the store. And it happens over and over again. And in 1991, there was a young schoolgirl, age 15, her name's Latasha Harlins. She walks into a store in Los Angeles, and she goes in, she grabs a juice bottle, and she gets into an argument with the Korean store owner. And they get to the point where the 16-year-old girl, she turns around, she walks away, and the Korean store owner pulls out a gun, shoots her in the head, and kills her. This is caught on video, on security film. So, this should have never happened. This young girl should never have been killed. And then when the Korean store owner goes to court, she doesn't spend a day in jail. Her prison time is suspended, and then that really creates such tension between so there's been a boiling over tension between the African Americans and the Korean Americans, because there's been tension of store owners and patrons taking place for about a decade. This killing takes place, and then, of course, as an African American, you're going to think, hey, these Asian Americans get away with everything. They even get away with murder on videotape. They don't go to jail. And so this tension happens. Then, it's in the air, it's palatable. Then the Rodney King happens. So Rodney King, everyone knows, he's driving, he's in LA, he gets pulled over, and on videotape, you see, I forget how many, 10, 11 cops beat him when he's down on the ground. They kick him, they hit him for no reason whatsoever. And then the cops are found not guilty. So again, the African American community, there's someone that's murdered. And then a year later, Rodney King on videotape gets beaten by 12 officers, and no one pays for it, right? So then that's when the LA riots break out. And in LA, there's a section called Koreatown, and there's where all the Korean shop owners are. And that was one of the most looted areas in LA, because the African Americans in that community felt that they had to go, they had every right to go into Koreatown and steal, destroy, burn, and and I see here 4 Los Angeles police officers were found not guilty of just heinous crimes. So that's really led to, and then the LA riots broke out, and it was really a big I mean, it was scary. So I'm over here in Wilmington, Delaware, where I was brought up, and my parents would even tell me, "Look, you don't know what's going on. Be aware of your surroundings. We're different. People won't like us just because of how we look. So make sure keep your head on a swivel." That's what my parents would tell me when I was, I think, maybe 14 years old at that time, and that was where all Korean parents were telling their kids, because we were afraid that something would happen to us. And
Wow.
I can see from both points of view why people were upset. I can understand the African American point of view. Now, the store owner, that is something that actually took me a hard time to really empathize or try to understand what she was going through, because what she did, she murdered a little girl for no reason. Should never have happened. But when you think about it, she comes over to this country with absolutely nothing. She works 7 days a week. If it's anything like my parents, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, no vacations, no days off, maybe take Christmas Day off. That's it. You work every day. And she was leading up to that day, her store was robbed so many times that it was known to go there. They would rob at gunpoint. She had guns. Her family had guns pointed at her. She was actually working that day because her son was going to testify against someone for robbing the store at gunpoint. And his life was being threatened that he couldn't go to work that day. So she actually had to go to work that day for him. So their store, it's kind of like the battered syndrome, battered wife syndrome, where the wife is getting beaten every day, and then she finally snaps and kills, the perpetrator, who's the husband or boyfriend who's beating her. It's the same situation where every day they're being robbed, attacked, verbally abused, physically intimidated, and then it snapped. So then really it was just, there's no condoning what she did. But when I sit and I think about what her state of mind is at that time, I can see where she snapped. Although it wasn't right. I just want people to understand that's why she snapped.
Yeah. I always go back to the psychological trauma of these events. And I agree with you. I think displaced anger is a real thing. She just got to a boiling point. Again, not justifying or rationalizing. However, there is an understanding, because if you're constantly being victimized with no justice, and we see that even in the African American community, that's what happened with the Rodney King riots. Think about it. A young girl gets killed and nothing happens. The system of society, the justice system, again, fails the African American community. She got no time. She didn't spend one day in jail, right? And then you have African Americans who are being caught with, a couple of, not justifying or rationalizing, with marijuana, a couple of joints, and they get locked up and sentenced for who knows how long, right? And so for the African American community, I think there's a boiling point of tension too, and that happened when these 4 officers were acquitted of using, and they were charged with bodily harm with a deadly weapon, but they were all acquitted. So there was just an explosion that happened over the course of those 5 days in Los Angeles. That was just unfortunate. And I have to agree with you, Jimmy, that there comes a point in time where, enough is enough. And I think that's my concern about what's happening in modern day society in 2022 with all the mass shootings of unarmed individuals, and not just people of color that are dying as a result of these senseless and what I call cowardly acts. I just feel that at some point, members of society is just going to have enough. And marching is great, but I don't think marching at this point is getting enough results. We have to talk about some action. What is going to be some of the actions? And John, we really spoke about that earlier today in our discussion about empathy. And I wanted just to know if you had any thoughts about that, about the action part.
So for me personally, I agree. I think marching is not the action that needs to be taken. I mean, that's maybe some of it. The action that I believe that needs to be taken there, people need to go out and vote. We had how many in this country, we had this amazing ability to cast the vote to who leads our country. And if we hit a 50% mark of people who vote that have a right to vote, we think that's an amazing mark to hit. We should be having 70, 80, 90% of people who can vote to go and vote. That's what we have to do. We have to educate ourselves and vote vote our leaders in. And this is a great country where it's a democracy. We can have the majority of the country wants someone to come in and run our country. That's who comes in. If it's Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. But we have to exercise our right to vote, and we don't take that seriously. We have to educate our parents, our cousins, our children. We have to go out and vote. If we don't vote, I think we're doing a disservice to our family, our friends, to ourselves.
Yeah, that's the action. I agree with that. That's the action. I also think just educating yourself on other cultures. I mean, I live and breathe this work, and so for me, I like to learn about different cultures and different ethnic experiences, because what I tend to find when I do that is that the only thing that's different is in the region that we live, that we grew up in, or the color of our skin. But we all have had some type of traumatic experiences, trials and triumphs, sacrifices in life. And we also have had some successes. And so where we have come up in society. So the more I think that we learn about each other and each other's struggles and each other's successes, there won't be this fear and this threat and this worrying about, I just think we just need to, and no pun intended, like Rodney King said, can't we all just get along? I mean, in society, that was his word when he was interviewed. John, you started to say something?
Did anything positive come out of this? Just a firestorm of intersecting terrible things. The story is a terrible story. I mean, it's just all sorts of things were bad, happened the wrong way. But anything good come of it in Los Angeles?
I mean, what I think is good is that there is now really strong attempts and groups to learn other people's cultures. For Korean Americans to learn African American culture, for African Americans to learn the Korean American culture. I know that I have some friends out there that have run organizations out there that really promote the bringing of these, different communities together. And that is the silver lining, that is the positive, but there isn't enough. Obviously, there hasn't been enough. And that's an issue here in our area as well. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was, my belief is, and again, it goes back to the Rodney King, why can't we all just get along? When you first heard that, you thought it was kind of cheesy, but it's so true. It goes to the heart of it. And so I grew up playing sports. And when you're playing sports and when you're on that, I grew up playing soccer on that soccer field, your teammates, it doesn't matter what color they are, it doesn't matter where they're from, economic, social background, all that matters is you guys had one goal that you're trying to do and you're trying to win. You guys, you were out there, you worked, you sweat, bled, you went through trials, triumphs, everything together and brings you together. And that was that's our band of brothers. So the best man in my wedding, I never went to school with. We grew up playing soccer together our whole life. And that we grew up at an age, we were 6, 7 years old where we weren't exposed to these world stereotypes, and we didn't start having these, unfortunate stereotypes built into us. So my goal was really, I want to and I start with soccer, it could be basketball, or any league where we bring in people from different communities, and hopefully it's funded so we can bring lower income communities from all different races on a team, and they can go and they can create this friendship, this bond at a young age. So when they get older, they're going to know each other. We can shake hands. We develop the bond before these stereotypes are developed. Then their parents will be developing bonds as well, because the kids are developing the bonds, and they'll go to games together, they'll go to tournaments together, spend the night together. And that's really in my mind, one of the things I want to do before I leave this earth is to create a program to do that. That's really one of the goals I've been thinking for the past 2 or 3 years.
So
Yeah,
I
I wanted to respond, John, when you said what has happened since then. Has any positive things happened? And I think this resonates with Jimmy's call to action to vote, because a year later, one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the riots is that there was an item on the ballot in Los Angeles, and the voters approved to limit the term limits, because in Los Angeles, the police chief had a lifetime term limit. He could be voted in, keep voted and voted in. And so they voted that to adjust it to 2 5-year terms. So the maximum that person could serve was 10 years as police chief. And they voted in the same year, they voted that this police chief is ousted, because there was no reprimand of the officers. Yeah. And then he was replaced by the former police chief for Philadelphia, Willie Williams, who was the first African-American police chief for the city of Los Angeles. So I think the power of the vote, like Jimmy said, is very important. Even on the local level, they was able to make some type of some form of police reform through the power of the vote to get this guy, the former police chief out of office. Yeah, Darrell Gates was his name at the time.
Yeah, I had a couple of other thoughts. I think you're right about sports, by the way, Jimmy. It's going to be a long time, but eventually there has to be election reform. The chaos theory will apply. We'll continue to have chaos, but the chaos theory is that eventually chaos gets resolved. We all have to hope that it gets resolved by, high-minded election reform, because a lot of good-minded people want positive change in these kinds of issues. And even though as a nation we may have the votes, our system is stacked against that. So that's one thing. But the other thought I had was that, we've experienced it in our family, and I bet there are a lot of other predominantly white families who now have people of color, of all different colors, who are members of their family. In some cases, and I have friends the same way, in some cases it's adoptive children, in some cases it's interracial marriage and so forth. And so when that happens, if you have an opportunity in your family to get to know the person deeper than otherwise. And when you get to know a person, that you begin to see them as a person. You don't begin to see them as a Black person or a Asian person. You begin to see them as people with common interest in family. So you have a common basis to appreciate other cultures and other races just within your own family. And that, I think, is happening all across the country. And over time, that's going to have a major impact, I think. Yep. It'll happen naturally. and unfortunately, it'll take time. But I've already seen evidence of it, my own personal experience. So that gives me some hope. And the other thought I had was, going back what you said earlier about, the emphasis on the narrative and changing the narrative. Um, a a um, a strategic, organized, collaborative approach of different organizations to change the narrative to the positive narrative, to counter the continual beating of the negative, narrative. I wonder whether that's. I don't see that being that organized. It's organized by issue, maybe, but not across issues. Maybe I hadn't really thought about it, but that just came to mind as we were talking about that. So, well, this is a good maybe a place to conclude, since we've already recorded an earlier version. But Jimmy, any other thoughts either of you have on this subject? This has really been good today.
Yeah, I just think as a follow-up discussion, we just have to keep our pulse on, again, the political arena, educating about voting. You mentioned the chaos theory, John. I think, when chaos is created, sometimes chaos is created for control. And
yeah.
In the Rodney King and then the death of the shooting of Latasha Hollings, in my opinion, the judge created more chaos than necessary when it was a female judge, allowed no consequences to be handed down for what was clearly a murder. And so I think the system is designed to create chaos so that control can continue to be bestowed on certain members of society. So I think until we correct that aspect of it, I'm hopeful. I'll stay hopeful, but I'm also reminded of the systems and the powers that are in place and that has been in place for a very long time in this country. And until we dismantle some of that, we're gonna have a uphill battle. But I'm confident. I get very hopeful when I see my daughters interplay with their kids, with their friends. They just had their birthday party, and it was just amazing to see all the different kids, Asian kids, white kids, Black kids, Spanish kids. And I saw the future of our society in the little ones. And I'm hoping we could, hopefully somehow we could package just the innocence of the way they engage with each other and make some type of pill to give to some of us adults.
To give some adults, yeah. Right.
Yes, I think we would get some. We would be one of the top pharmaceutical companies in the world.
Well, you could make a lot of money if you came up with
that.
Right.
Yeah. So that would be my end commentary for today's discussion.
How about you, Jimmy?
And this may be for another discussion, but I keep exactly what you said. I agree, because there's that narrative that somehow gets brought about in society, that the chaos also is control, where I believe that the model minority label on Asian Americans was created to pit one community against Asian Americans, saying, why can't you be like these Asian Americans?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, part of the overall, interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In agreement, Jimmy.
But the one thing, though, is America, in my mind, is the best country in the world. And it is because of our diversity. Our diversity is a strength.
It's our best asset. Yep.
We
That's
have
right.
to stop. People will say diversity, the reason why there's so much, violence or tension in America, is because of there's so many different races and communities. I disagree. I think that's our strength and that's a benefit. And we have to continue to look at that as a positive, never put that in negative light.
I agree.
Okay.
Awesome.
Oh. Well, this is great. Thanks very much for joining us again, Jimmy.
Thank you for having me. It's great talking to you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
It's always great to thank you so much for what you guys do and really bringing these discussions to light.
Awesome. Thank you all for attending and listening in and viewing into another episode of the Race to Social Justice. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. We would love to hear your comments about each and every episode, and we'll see you on the next run, the next lap that we'll take on the Race to Social Justice. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.